If you've been following, you know that Tales of Asia is a series of talks that are based on this book. And what it does is sort of juxtaposes archival images from the various port cities that are featured in this book and images of photography from the cities today, just to give you a sense of how the cities used to look like then and how they look like today. So today is the fourth talk. If you've missed the first three talks, they're actually all online, so I'll share the link for the videos of this talk towards the end of the talks today. As you can see, we've done a sort of physical grand tour of Singapore, even as we do a virtual grand tour of Southeast Asia. And again, I want to thank NLB and May for the privilege of being able to do these talks in the public libraries in Singapore. So, the setting for Tales of Asia is Southeast Asia, or what was known as the East Indies for much of the 1800s and 1900s. And where have we traveled so far? First week we went to Portuguese Malacca and Spanish Manila. We made a stopover in Batavia in the Netherlands East Indies 2 weeks ago. Last week at ACM we went to the Siamese Empire, and today we're visiting French Indochina, specifically the cities of Saigon and Hanoi, leaving the cities of the British Empire for the last talk next Saturday. Yes, very, very sort of big responsibility for that last talk when it rounds everything up. Okay, so let's just dive right in. French Indochina, l'Indochine française. So when one thinks of French Indochina today, this is a map, a tourist map from the 1930s, you think of three countries, right? Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. But actually, French Indochina was actually constituted of 6 different territories. There was Tonkin, Annam, Cochin China, and this correspond to North, Central, and South Vietnam today. Le Cambodge, Cambodia, Laos, and interestingly, Guangzhou Wan is sort of an enclave in China that was going to be France's equivalent of Hong Kong. And French Indochina existed all the way till 1954 when the French left the country. The cities, the major cities of French Indochina, I think we know and are very familiar with, Hanoi, Hue, Saigon, Phnom Penh, and Vientiane. And here I'm using sort of the French spelling for these cities. So it was a place of very spectacular, epic landscapes and contrasts in the kinds of sights you would see. Of course, in French Indochina there was Halong Bay. This is a 1920s postcard of a junk as well as a passenger or tourist ship going along Halong Bay. There's another view. And then there were also these interesting sort of beach or hill resorts that the French established as they took sojourners out of the city. There's Cap Saint-Jacques, which was a beach resort very near Saigon. Dalat, a hill station and resort. Spectacular ruins in French Indochina, Angkor being the highlight of this. And sort of very ancient, exotic cultures that were sort of, the French were very curious about and sort of, in some ways, documented but also objectified a little bit. And other than the big capital cities, there were also smaller, charming cities, such as the port city of Haiphong, and another city along the Saigon River known as Vinh Long, which was kind of a stop for boats going up the river. And so our story today, we start our journey in the south today, the province of Cochin China. In particular, in the city of Saigon here, which sits very near the mouth of the Saigon River. And between 1887 and 1902, it was the capital of French Indochina. It was most certainly the biggest port of the colonial territory at the time. It is also the biggest port city of Vietnam today. At the same time, it was also the financial and economic capital of the colony, as it is still, as Ho Chi Minh City is still today. I think I'm starting to echo. But it always it wasn't always a French territory. So this is a map from 1815, what shows it what it used to look like before the French came. So actually this entire area of Cochin China used to be part of the Khmer Empire. And in the 1800s, the Vietnamese emperors from the north, the Nguyen emperors, actually they sort of came down south and took over the southern, I'm a bit distracted. They took over the southern territories. They called it Nankin or Nanjing. You know, they came and they sort of conquered and took over the south, the southern bits of what is Vietnam today. And what they did, the emperors did, was they established a citadel here in what is today's Saigon, the citadel of Jiading. Yeah. Of course, way before that, the Chinese had also been there trading for centuries, and they traded in this area called Cholon. In Chinese, in Cantonese, it's read Daion, Tian, which means embankment. And so they continue to be there in Ho Chi Minh City today. So, in 1859, the French came. They laid siege to the citadel of Jiading, and they captured Saigon. And they would not leave till 1954, and this is sort of just under 100 years. So they came and they flattened the citadel. As you can see, it's no more there. And in its place, they built a European city, which they called Saigon. And there are different theories as to what Saigon actually means. And one of the theories is that it's the name of Saigon in Chinese is Cai Gun, which is sort of like Cai is firewood and Gun is stick. But that's disputed. Where was I? Okay, so enough of the history. So let's imagine you are a European tourist leaving for the East in the 1920s. What you would have done is you would have departed from Marseille on one of these cruise ships of the Messagerie Maritime, which was the French mail and shipping company. In those days, the only way to travel in long distance was through ships. Up until sometime in the 30s and the 40s, and these ships were incidentally passenger ships. I mean, the ships came about initially because they had to take mail from Europe to the various colonies and territories in the rest of the world, and it eventually became lucrative also to carry passengers long distance. So you would have departed from Marseille and gone through the Suez Canal, rounded India, go through the Straits of Malacca, rounded Singapore to finally get to Saigon, which was the far eastern HQ of the MM, the Messagerie Maritime. And there you would have embarked at the sort of the port of Saigon, which is here, very near to the headquarters of the Messagerie Maritime. You can see this is the same view today. Not very much has changed. The Messagerie Maritime building is there. It is now a museum of Ho Chi Minh's life, and the port of Saigon is still there. So this is one of those, the bateau, one of those big cruise ships that you would have arrived in, and you would have disembarked with your boxes and boxes of trunks of clothing and to last you for months and months. And so from the port of Saigon, we will take a carriage into the centre-ville, the center of a town, where we will sort of explore the city of Saigon, which, as I mentioned, was a very European-style city. So first we learn, let's just talk a bit about the parts of the city actually, and how the city was planned. The French came very late into the game of colonialism in the East Indies. In fact, I think they were the very last. They arrived here in the 1800s, more than 100 years after the British arrived. And so in terms of building a new city, you'll find that basically what they did was to just import the principles of city planning from France, lock, stock, and barrel, and brought it here. And only later, eventually, did the architectural style evolve a little bit to take into account the tropical climate as well as the more Vietnamese styles of architecture. So this is my own sort of, conjecturing, my own observation of what the French philosophy of urban planning was, at least in the colonies. In Singapore, we have 5 C's. And in this case, I think you observe sort of the 3 C's of the urban planning in Saigon. Le catholicisme, religion was quite important. La culture, of course, high art and culture. And la civilisation, which is like French civilization in general, which was rational and sort of liberal and based on sort of Descartesian principles. And you see these principles actually played out in these sort of wide, boulevards of Saigon, the Saigon city, and these sort of radiating arcs, which actually echo Haussmann's Paris at the same time. You also see it in the sort of neoclassical and Beaux-Arts, architecture that you find in the city. Again, that kind of could have come straight out of Paris and Marseille. So let's look at the essential parts of the city, and we'll visit each of these parts in turn. Of course, there's the cathedral, the center of religion in the city, post office, Hôtel des Postes, the city hall, Hôtel de Ville, the Palais du Gouvernement, which is like government house, I suppose, in the English equivalent of it. The Théâtre Municipal is the opera house. Actually, we'll see that it actually looks like an opera house. The hotel, the Grand Hotel. You needed a Grand Hotel to house the visitors that came through. The shopping street, right? You need sort of the street for the fashionable shopping. Cercle Sportif, the club for the European community. The Halle Centrale, which is the marketplace. And finally, the museum and the Botanic Gardens. All of this, more or less, still exists today in Ho Chi Minh City, right? So you have the cathedral, post office, city hall, what is now called the Reunification Palace, the theater, Hotel Continental, the shopping street has now become Dong Khoi Street, which means Reunification Street. The Cercle Sportif is now sort of the Labor Culture Palace, the market, and the museum. So let's dive in and visit each of these monuments in turn. The cathedral, built in a high Gothic style, again straight out of France. This was built in 1880 and it still stands today. Not much has changed in terms of the actual building, but around the building is quite significantly different now. I mean, of course, at the time, this was a square and it was pedestrianized. There's lots of people sort of, hanging out after Mass on Sundays and so on. Today, of course, it's just a hellhole of traffic, sort of, the cathedral sits in this island and just thousands and thousands and thousands of motorbikes and traffic rounding the cathedral, and it's fiendishly difficult to actually even cross the street to get there. So, huge difference. As you can see also, I mean, all these sort of new malls and high-rises are rising up just behind or around the building. Okay, the post office, neoclassical style of architecture, very sort of wedding cake-like. It was built in 1891. I read somewhere, I may not be, I don't know how accurate this is, that it was actually designed by Gustave Eiffel, who designed the Eiffel Tower, so I hear. And it looks more or less the same today, outside and inside, except of course, inside you have the beaming face of Mr. Ho Chi Minh sort of presiding over everything. It's a delightful, delightful building to visit with. And it's still the post office, so it still feels very, very old school with all these transactions, everyday transactions taking place inside. City Hall, I think it's like a kind of Beaux-Arts architecture. It's built in 1908. Again, like I said, it's sort of kind of straight out of Paris. The same today, except of course with one difference, Ho Chi Minh statue sitting right in front of it. It is still the City Hall in Ho Chi Minh City today. This was the government house, the Palais du Gouvernement, and it was one of the early buildings to be built in the city. It was built in 1873 in this kind of palace, palatial, kind of Beaux-Arts style architecture. And unfortunately, during the Vietnam War, part of it was actually destroyed. A whole wing was actually destroyed in 1962. And so another building was built in 1966 in a kind of more serious and severe modernist style. And so this is now called the Reunification Palace. And it's called the Reunification Palace because in 1975, a North Vietnamese tank drove right through the building. And that act ended the Vietnam War and reunited North and South Vietnam. Okay, the Opera House. Built in 1897. It was inspired by the Paris Opera, of course, and the Petit Palais in Paris. And actually, at the time when visitors came from Europe and from France, they actually found it a very tacky copy of the original in Paris. Well, this scene is interesting, I guess, because you have all these sort of, a sense of daily life, then sort of the people, going about their promenades in the daytime and so on, their trishaws. And if you look at this today, it's practically the same. The context is more or less the same. The building is more or less the same. The context is only slightly different. The people are different. The mode of transportation these days is no longer trishaw, clearly. Where else? So the Opera House sits somewhere here on this square, which is called the Square Francis Garnier. For some reason, in both Saigon and Hanoi, the word square is used instead of place. And I'm not quite sure why, but all the sort of squares in the French Indochina cities are called squares in French. So the Square Francis Garnier sits on Rue Catina, which is the sort of the Champs-Élysées or the Orchard Road of Saigon. So it was on this square that if you were, that the fashionable would gather, you do your promenade, the flaneur would walk down the streets to see and be seen. This is where you had all the wonderful street-side cafes and the hotels and the delicatessens and boutiques and so on. This square is significant because on it sits the city's Grand Hotel, the Hotel Continental or the Continental Palace Hotel. And here also sits another building called the Eden Center. And it was known for an Austrian patisserie, the Café Chiffra, that served the best sort of patisserie in the city at the time. The hotel still stands, but this has become sort of a high-rise mall. So, a bit more about the Hotel Continental. It was very famous because it hosted the likes of the writers and the celebrities and royalty at the time. Somerset Maugham sat here on this terrace, and when he wrote some of his books. Later on, if you have read books by Graham Greene, The Quiet American, parts of the story are also set here. And the lead character in Graham Greene's The Quiet American stayed in this hotel, and this hotel was actually sort of like a viper's nest of spies at the time. Right. Okay, so here are some more views of the street in the past and today. Then you can see it was a very sort of leafy, pleasant, lined sidewalk. It could be something out of the south of France. This was a view in the 1890s. This is from the 1920s. And the street was also known for some famous stores. Like this was A. Guillonnet, which is a charcuterie store. You get your sort of cured meats and so on. The Café Imperial is one of the sort of famous cafes on the street, and it still exists today. Although it's a bit touristy now, and it's no longer Café Imperial, something else I can't recall. The Café Brodard was another place that was very famous for its teas and coffees and patisserie. This is like in the 1930s. And this is what it is today, unfortunately. no longer that. Yeah, what else? The street, I'm going to flash a series of vintage advertising, advertising from the 1920s and 30s, just to give you a sense of how the street was like. Thai Duck was a very famous sort of specialty deli on the streets, kind of like Jason's or Marketplace, Cold Storage Gourmet type of place on the street, where they had stuff that came from France, where all the food stuff that came from France. And you see, this is just some advertising from the 1930s. Galerie Lafayette was on the street, malls, pharmacies. Nouveau de Catina is another sort of big departmental store. The Comptoir Généraux, where you got the furniture and industrial sort of products. Colonial had a show house, showroom right there on Boulevard Charnay, which is actually perpendicular to La Rue Catina. These two were the sort of main shopping streets. Again, big departmental stores, the Pont de l'Indochine and so on, showing you really that the heart of the city was very, very bustling, especially down these two streets. So, I had something to, that's right. So these kind of scenes of Rue Catina, provide you a sense of life in the city at the time. And I mentioned actually that the city felt a bit like one of those smaller cities in the south, in the Midi or in the south, like Nice or Toulouse. And on the streets at least, you would get sort of the fashionable dresses that you would see in Marseille, probably a few seasons late because of the travel. Everything essentially that you could buy in Paris and Marseille, you could buy here in Rue Catina in Saigon. So a bit more about the French in Saigon. I think initially they were military. The military came first, and then the civil servants who sort of were responsible for governing the colony. Eventually the businessmen also came with their families and their children. And the center of the social scene, I guess in most colonial territories, was the club. But there's a difference. The British typically had that sort of gentleman's club, where you go and you sit gin slings with other other of your mates. But for the French, it was slightly different. They had their cercle sportif, which was a little more sort of family activity oriented, not just for the gentlemen, but for sort of the families and children and so on. The other center of the social scene was the hotel, of course. So this is a view of the terrace of the Hotel Continental in the 1890s. And you can see, like the fashionable set sort of descending on the hotel terrace to see and be seen and to entertain themselves. In fact, in the movie Indochina with Catherine Deneuve, there's one scene that's set in what is supposedly the terrace of the Hotel Continental, where Catherine Deneuve sort of talks with the Armenian owner-proprietor of the hotel. The Armenians, of course, were known hotel proprietors all over Southeast Asia, and I'll talk a bit about that in next week's talk. If Rue Catina was the Champs-Élysées or the Orchard Road, and for sort of the everyday people, you went here, the Halles Centrales, the central market, to get your daily provisions. It was kind of like the wet market plus of Saigon at the time. You could get fresh food. You could also get sort of basics of the kitchen and pots and pans and clothes and so on. And this is how it looks like today, Bintan Market. And this building is quite significant. This was built in 1912, at which point the French had been here for about half a century. And so you see also that the architecture has started to evolve. And this is sort of the beginnings of this Indo-Chinese style, where the form is essentially European. I mean, this is sort of a standard clock tower. Many marketplaces in colonial Southeast Asia have clock towers, also in India. But you see the style of the tower is a little more Vietnamese now. So there are elements, the roof in particular sort of draws reference from traditional Vietnamese temples and palaces. Sorry, I have a clicker. This Indo-Chinese style continued to develop and evolve all the way through the 20s, and because there were a new generation of architects that came from France who were more willing to sort of experiment with local, to understand and to learn more about local architectural styles, and also experiment with architecture that was suitable for the tropical or subtropical climate. And the form, I think, has its most eloquent expression in this building, the Musée Blanchard de la Poste, which sat in the Botanic Gardens at the time. It was built in 1929. Again, in form, if you look at it far away, you think it's a Vietnamese pagoda, but it actually sat alongside sort of colonnades that are, in essence, European. So the form of the building is European, but the adornments are Vietnamese. Today, this is the Vietnam History Museum. So, let me see what. Okay, so I have a short video to play just to give you a sense of how the city looked like at the turn of the century, 1900s, and then we'll go on to Hanoi. So let me just play this. Let me just turn the... It came from a Vietnamese documentary, so there will be, Vietnamese commentary. I'm going to start. This is the approach to Saigon city, and I'm just going to start when we're already in the city. Oops. All right, here we go. So this was the government house, which was also known as the Norodom Palace at the time, named after King Norodom I of Cambodia. This is the residence of the Governor General of Cochin China. Today, it is the Museum of the City of Ho Chi Minh. Okay, I will stop talking for a bit.
Theo Việt Nam Sử Lược, năm 1695,
City Hall.
Chủ lệnh Phục Chu gửi ông Nguyễn Hữu Cảnh làm kinh lược đất Chân Lạp, đặt Sài Gòn làm huyện Tân Bình. Năm 1772, ông Nguyễn Cửu Đàm bắt đầu ra lệnh xây lấp những con kênh để làm Sài Gòn tiếp tục phát triển. Theo tác giả của cuốn Gia đình Phong còn gọi là tiếng Nam chỉ bông gòn hay cây gòn. Nhưng đối với cả thế giới, Sài Gòn là một thành phố với lối kiến trúc pha trộn của hai nền văn hóa Đông Tây, cũng như những sinh hoạt thương mại và văn hóa của một thành phố nổi tiếng thế giới. Những địa danh nổi tiếng của Sài Gòn nếu kể hết thì chắc chắn không thể nào tóm gọn trong một video nhỏ bé này. Nhưng chúng ta cũng nên nhắc qua một số địa danh lừng lẫy mà không ai không biết tới.
So this was in 1900, the year 1900.
Ở giữa thủ đô Sài Gòn là chợ Bến Thành, đã được xây lần đầu tiên bên bờ sông Bến Nghé, nhưng sau đó bị quân Pháp phá hủy vào năm 1859. Chợ Bến Thành được tái lập và rời về địa điểm ngày nay.
Unfortunately, I wish I could give you a running commentary of what they're saying, but I don't speak that.
Đã được linh mục Colonial đặt viên đá đầu tiên vào ngày 7 tháng 10 năm 1877. 3 năm sau, ngôi thánh được hoàn tất vào năm 1880. Cho đến năm 1962, tòa thánh La Mã đã nâng cấp ngôi nhà thờ này đến mức vương cùng thánh đường, và đây là một nền thánh diện cho các tín đồ Thiên Chúa giáo tại Việt Nam. Về phía Phật giáo, những ngôi chùa vĩ đại được nhiều người biết tới, nhưng vĩ đại nhất vẫn là chùa Vĩnh Nghiêm, hoàn tất vào năm 1971, là một công trình của kiến trúc sư Nguyễn Bá Lăng. Nói về những địa danh của Sài Gòn, còn phải nhắc đến Lăng Ông Bà Triều. Nhiều lắm, những nơi hò hẹn của giới trẻ, các rạp cine, những buổi tối hẹn nhau ở các quán ăn ở ngã 6, đường phát thanh giản, ở Bàn Cờ, chợ lớn, chợ cũ, Tân Định.
Actually, quite a lot of this. I mean, maybe not this, but quite a lot of the, the sort of ladies carrying their baskets and motorbikes still very much exist in Ho Chi Minh City today. So it's not very much different from the 60s, in my view. Okay, so Those views of Saigon in the 1900s sort of remained until around 1930s, and then of course we know what happened just after that. They had a series of 3 major wars. They're out of the scope of my my book or the talk actually, but just to recall what these were. There was World War II in the 40s. They were the Indochinese War in the 50s, sort of the war of Vietnamese independence, and the Indochinese War then segued into the 20-year Vietnam War, which ran from 1950s to 1975. And today, Ho Chi Minh City is still feeling the sort of lingering impact of the Vietnam War, which is very vividly depicted here in this mural in the Ho Chi Minh City Museum, which used to sit in the government of Cochin China's palace. I like to think of this as sort of the Ho Chi Minh's version of the musical Miss Saigon, And of course, everywhere in the city also there's this ubiquitous portraits of Ho Chi Minh, reminding you again that this is no longer Saigon, but Ho Chi Minh City. And I think in the last decade or so, the Saigoners or Ho Chi Minhers, I suppose, are only now sort of reviving or waking up from the shadow of the war with the liberalization of the economy and sort of with a larger middle class. Even as they sort of look forward, they're also looking back to sort of traditions of Vietnam, ancient traditions of Vietnam, to find the inspiration and grounding, but also they've been looking back at the legacy of the French. I think you will find that there's a lot more restoration going on in the city today. A lot of the sort of decrepit villas and colonial buildings from before now house restaurants and bars and lifestyle sort of establishments. So, and I guess this is a part of the way of reconciling themselves to a past that was quite painful. Okay, but let's go back to the 1920s. From Saigon, we sail north to Tonkin, the northernmost province of Indochina. We drop anchor there at the city of Hanoi, which sits by the banks of the Red River, the Hongjiang. And unlike the French had before us, we step off our boat and we find something very strange. And we are going to encounter a culture that has been here for far, far, far longer than we had ever imagined. So, just some background on the city. Hanoi was established in 1010 by the Emperor Li Taizu, which literally means the first emperor of the Li dynasty. That Li, of course, is the same surname as the Lis of the Tang dynasty and the Lis of Singapore. So if you are Li, the chances are very high that you end up ruling some nation, or rather, this is proven by historical record. So when it was established in the 1000s, I guess, it was called Tang Long, Sheng Long, which means rising dragon, ascending dragon. And then sometime in the 1500s, its name changed. Now I'm going through like a very super fast history of the 1,000-year history of Hanoi. So its name changed to Dongqing or Dongjing. And this is when the Europeans came, and they sort of mistook the city for the entire province, and they called it Tonkin. Yeah. Dongjing, of course, means eastern capital. It is read as such, Dongqing in Vietnamese. In Japanese, it is read Tokyo, and of course Tokyo is the other eastern capital. In 1802, the Nguyen emperors moved the capital from Hanoi down to Hue. And so then, around then, the name of the city changed again to Hanoi, or Henei, which means kind of, very hard to translate, is in the river, or between the rivers. So I think it should be quite evident from this, the last slide with a lot of Chinese characters, that there is a deeper cultural influence at play here. The Chinese colonized Vietnam for 1,000 years, from the Han Dynasty, from 100 BC to the Tang Dynasty, 900 AD. And during the Han Dynasty, Vietnam was known as Nam Viet, Nan Yue. And the Tang Dynasty was known as An Nan. And there were An Nan means two things. It could mean peace in the south, but it could also mean we suppressed the south, you know, Annan, so we are keeping them quiet. So then, in around 900 AD, a sort of Vietnamese bloke came around and managed to sort of get rid of the Chinese and secure independence for Vietnam, and he founded the kingdom of Dai Viet, or Da Yue. But for some reason, the name An Nan refused to go away, and it continued to stay. Even when the French came, as you can see, there's a province that's called that was called Annam in French Indochina. So, 1,000 years of colonization doesn't go away just like that, and the Chinese influence actually pervades Vietnamese culture and created a sort of a very unique Sino-Vietnamese culture that was different from the Chinese. There's one instance where Chinese culture still is very strong, is in the language. So the Vietnamese language is known as Dien Viet, Sheng Yue. And you heard it just now, more or less. It sounds, I mean, it basically sounds a bit like one of the southern Chinese dialects, like Cantonese or Hokkien, and it is based on Chinese script. Until sometime in the 1800s also, the Vietnamese wrote with Chinese characters, what they called Chu Nong, which consisted of actual Chinese characters alongside Chinese characters that were invented, so that only exist in the Vietnamese language. And of course, in the 1800s, when the French Jesuits first came, the language was too difficult. So they created, based on Portuguese, actually, a Latin-based script to convey Vietnamese, and it was called Quoc Mu Guo Yu, which means national language, and that is still in use today. But just, you know that even if it's Latinized, most Vietnamese words today still correspond to a specific Chinese character. Okay, so let's return to the city, and we'll be, let me just see how much time I have left actually. Okay, yeah. And we'll be touring three of the most important landmarks in ancient Hanoi. The first is this lake, Hoan Kiem Lake, Hoan Jian Hu. The interesting thing about the Vietnamese language is they put the noun first before the name, so it's always Hu Hoan Kiem, or you know, we'll see later the temple and then the name of the temple, right? And so this lake is as old as the city itself, and so it is steeped in mysticism. And the reason why it's called Hoan Kiem Lake is like so, because there was a bloke in the 1400s who, during the time, Vietnam was occupied briefly by the Ming China, China during the Ming Dynasty, and he was visited by the Dragon King of the Eastern Seas, the Long Wang, who gave him a sword, which he used to successfully banish the Ming from China and regain Vietnamese independence again. He established his own kingdom, his own dynasty, and one day he was boating on the lake when from the depths came this golden turtle, took the sword from him, and slipped into the lake again. And so the king realized that the golden turtle was actually an avatar of the Dragon King come to take back the sword, and so he called the lake the Lake of the Restored Sword. So this is the iconic view of Hanoi over the ages. This is like one of the key landmarks is this temple, the Jade Mountain Temple. And you see this in countless sort of postcards and prints over the ages. This is from the 1890s. Another view from the 1900s, covered with lotuses, painting of the bridge. This is sort of it's very hard to translate this name, Qi Xu Qiao, something about keeping the dawn on the bridge. You see this here today, and again, just to note the very strong Chinese influence. I mean, you see Chinese characters and calligraphy everywhere. This is a terrible touristy photo, but lovely. Because there's a lovely couplet here, and I'll just read it out. 不厌湖上月，宛在水中央. How could we ever tire of the lake, of the moon above the lake, when it so beautifully hangs, floats in the middle of the water? Yeah, here's another one. These couplets that I won't read this. that sits on the building. And the other sort of key landmark in the lake is this, the Tatua, or the Turtle Tower. Rui, Ta Rui. Rui means a very specific kind of freshwater turtle, of which there used to be many in the lake, and these turtles were known to be sort of magical. Unfortunately, I think there's only one more in the lake right now, and it's very, very ill, and so this subspecies of turtle is in danger of being extinct. More views of the lake. This looks just like it's out of a Chinese landscape painting. This is a postcard from the late 1800s. View of that again, and of course today, this is in winter when the lake is sort of covered in mist, and it's a very magical sight. The best time to go is in the morning at 6 a.m. when this happens, and then you really see the beauty of the lake without all the traffic going around it. Okay, very quickly. The second key landmark of the Chinese, or sorry, the ancient Hanoi is the Wenmiao Vanmu, which is a Confucius temple. And Confucius temples exist in China, of course, and in countries in China's original sphere of influence. So Japan, Korea, and Vietnam also has Confucius temples. And they were dedicated, I guess, to the sort of, worship is not the right word, I guess, of worship in the way of Confucius. But they were also, okay, I will skip through these because I don't think we have time. But they were also, this was also the Imperial Academy. So this would have been the place where young Vietnamese men would have come, to take the imperial examinations to become a civil servant in the during the emperor's time. Of course, this was discontinued in the 1800s, but from about 1400s to 1800s, this is inside the temple. There were the successful candidates of the imperial examinations. Names were carved on all these stone steels that are carried by giant turtles, and there are I think like a few dozen of them in the temple. They date from the 1400s till today. And I think that, to me, I find it very haunting because you see all these names of these people that have come here before. Okay, so the final part of ancient Hanoi that was the imperial citadel of Tam Long. This was the palace. It was where the Vietnamese kings lived until they moved the capital down to Hue. And unfortunately, most of the citadel was actually destroyed when the French came. You can see it here in the late 1800s. And in its place, so here's just like a view of the North Gate. This is what remains of it. Yeah, it still stands today. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is the other part of the citadel that still remains, the flag tower. The French came and they took the citadel in 1873. And at the time, because the capital was already in Hue, Hanoi was governed by mandarins. They were sort of nobility, members of nobility or royalty, and some of who were sort of related to the Yuan emperor. So this is kind of one of them, with the donkey, I suppose, with the parasols. I mentioned the Yuan emperors, and they moved the capital to Hue, known as Hua in Chinese. So when the French wrested control of the province of Tonkin and Hanoi over from the Yuan emperors who remained in the city of Hue in Annam, they retained the mandarins. These mandarins became sort of the viceroys of the city. And they still visibly had some power over the city. They lived in this beautiful palace, and they emerged in such wonderful processions of pomp. True power lay with the French, of course. They were just puppets really. The power went down even to like the streets. So this you can see is like an election of a chef de rue. I don't know how to translate that. It's like a leader or mayor of the street, and you can see the French gentleman definitely sort of exerting some power over the elections. And in 1902, Hanoi became the capital of French Indochina. The capital was shifted north from Saigon to Hanoi. And the French then set about building, again, a very European city over Hanoi. Right, so they left bits of the ancient city intact in terms of literature, but in the citadel, which was demolished, a sort of military precinct was built. And near the palace, the former palace, the new sort of palace of the French Governor General of Indochina. So this is what the citadel became, from a sort of a very Sino-Vietnamese structures to this very thoroughly planned European city. This was the palace of the Governor General, which still stands today. And near the heart of Hanoi, at Armchair Lake itself, the French would build their sort of residential, commercial quarter. Again, very similar to what they did in Saigon. And Hanoi is essentially two cities. There's the old town, which used to be the market quarter that sat just outside the walls of the citadel, and that still exists today. And it's kind of like a medieval warren of small streets. And then there's the French quarter. So let's quickly go through the old town. The old town is known for its 36 streets, or 36 hung, where each street actually has a different trade, so like tinsmiths or hats and so on. And interestingly, this is again my own conjecture. Of course, the Chinese word for hang means streets. So it also means sort of like trades or guilds. So this was the old door to the old town, which is wonderfully restored. Hang Ma, which is where they sort of burn paper. They sell paper offerings to burn, and also to the Chinese New Year decorations. Hang Non, they sold these conical hats that the Vietnamese used to wear. So again, the Chinese characters are my conjecture. It's very difficult to find the exact Chinese characters that correspond to this. Actually, I couldn't find it for many. Hang Dong, Sugar Street. This is a scene from today. Very, very different from before. Silk Street, Cotton Street. I think what's interesting when you walk in the old town, and only walk at dawn, where there are no people, no traffic, so that you can actually see the buildings, is there are all these shop houses, like the shop house architecture that you see all over Southeast Asia. You can also find here, but with some variations, of course. These are far more ornate, very much more influenced by the French tradition. Hang Peaks, Tinsmith Street, Hang Bay, Bamboo Street, Hang Man, Fish Sauce Street, Nam Pla, if you know, you eat Thai food. Hang Hom, Lacquer, and again, this is everywhere, these kind of shop house architecture. And what's also interesting in the old town, of course, again, this is like far-reaching Chinese influence. So you see like the door gods everywhere. Aside from the shop houses, you also see these sort of beautiful townhouses that would have been housed the wealthy at the time. But of course, many of them these days house many different families. Beautiful temples, like with bats and so on. Again, showing sort of very strong, deep-seated Chinese influence. Okay, but from the old town, we walk along the western banks of the river to the French city, which again has the trappings of a European city like Saigon. So the key things are that the cathedral, the opera, the shopping streets, Rue Baudelaire and Boulevard Duncan, the Banque de l'Indochine, the financial quarter, and of course, we just didn't show up the last time, but the police and the prison, which also was quite visible in this city. The museum. So let's go. And squares, again, sort of beautiful squares surrounded by great architecture in the city. So let's quickly go visit each of them in turn. The Cathedral of St. Joseph. It was built in 1886, again in a Gothic style, and it was actually built on the site of the city's temple that was demolished. A Buddhist temple that was demolished, and in its place, this was built. Very odd because it sits at the edge of the old town. And so that contrast, between the old town and this is very startling. Hui Polbert was the Hui Katina of the city, and at the edge of Ender it sat the Opera House, which again was influenced by the Paris Opera, and is the sister building to the one in Saigon. This is how it looks like today. Huge intersection with thousands and thousands of cars and motorbikes, and it sits right beside the Hilton. There are two Hiltons in Hanoi. The Hilton, which was built by the Americans in the 60s. Via Boulevard Dongkan, this is a huge, very famous department store in the city. Another one of these department stores. And alongside these department stores were also these, very quintessentially French sort of charcuteries and so on that made the whole bit of Hanoi very European. The Bank of Indochina. This was the Colonial Bank. So everywhere the French had the cities, there was the Bank of Indochina, and there were also branches in Shanghai and in Singapore and so on. This is today a government guest house. The police HQ. And this is the other Hilton, the Maison Centrale. It was a prison that was used to house the Vietnamese dissidents in the French colonial era. And of course, during the Vietnam War, American POWs were also held here. So there's a museum of the on site today. Behind the building, you can see this building interestingly, is this huge kind of mall development that has been developed by CapitaLand. So it's very strange. So I went to this, and then I went over there to the Starbucks in CapitaLand Mall. So, okay, again, the sort of Indo-Chinese style would find its expression in the museum. This is the Musée Louis Finot, and it was built, designed by an architect called Ernest Ebrard, who was also the urban planner for the city of Phnom Penh. He was one of those young architects who wanted to experiment a bit more with the Vietnamese style and with the tropical climate. Okay, I don't have time to go into detail. And this was one of the most beautiful squares in the city, the square Chavassieux. On one side of it was La Résidence Supérieure, which was the residence of the governor, the French governor. And on the other side is the famous Hotel Metropole, the Grand Hotel Metropole, the equivalent of Hotel Continental. It still stands there today. Again, one of those historic grand hotels that have welcomed celebrities and royalty and heads of state. It was restored sometime in the 2000s, and it's today run by the Sofitel Group as the Sofitel Legend Metropole Hanoi. And I think a visit to Hanoi has to include a visit to this hotel. They have one of the wonderful things that they have is these vintage Citroën cars from the 1950s you can actually hire out, and you can go about town in these cars, and everyone will be peering at you through the windows. But it feels very, very sort of nostalgic. It's a very nostalgic experience, and I highly recommend it. The other famous experience, of course, is to sit at the terrace of the Hotel Metropole to sip a tasse de thé, or a cup of coffee or tea or a glass of wine as you reflect over your journey in Hanoi and in all of French Indochina. And it is here that we end our tour today in French Indochina. Just some notes again. I mean, I think if for more details of the cities and of other cities, you can find them in my book. Just to highlight again, I'm very happy that the publishers are here today, and they brought the book to be sold at a discounted price of $30 instead of $45 at the bookstores. And I mentioned earlier that the videos of each of these talks are placed online, so you can find them either on the blog related to the book or at my Facebook page. And if you have anything you want to ask, also please feel free to email me. So these are some books that I've read in the course of doing research, and also that are in the library. There's some of them here today. Do please take a look. May and team have actually very spent some effort sort of putting them on the table there. But I highly recommend these three in red. Of course, Marguerite Duras' L'Amant, sorry, not L'amour, L'Amant, The Lover, this is quintessential colonial Saigon. I mean, the feel of the city is wonderfully recreated in the novel, and also the movie, although the movie is not as good, actually, the English. Very odd French movie made in English by a French director. Graham Greene, of course, The Quiet American, wonderful, wonderful book about spies in the Vietnam War, set in a continental hotel. And please go check out the film Indochina with Catherine Deneuve, again, a sort of quintessential movie about Indochina. So, finally, my last talk of the series next week will be in the Library Orchard next Saturday at 2 p.m. And in it, we'll visit Rangoon, Penang, and Singapore. And we'll be exploring how the pomp and the might of the British Empire is sort of expressed in urban planning in Rangoon, for example. And we'll pay a visit to Southeast Asia's most famous hoteliers and their grand hotels. And finally, we end up our journey ultimately in this grand emporium city of Singapore, where we will sum up all that we have learned in the entire series so far, and how all of this is very important to us being in Singapore and being Singaporeans. So, once again, please do join me next week at Library Orchard, and I thank you so very much for hearing me ramble on. Thank you.